Finding my birth family was supposed to complete me, but it destroyed me instead. For my 28th birthday, my fiancé bought me a DNA ancestry kit. I'd been adopted as a baby, and he thought it would be fun to learn about my ethnic background and maybe find some cousins. A few weeks later, I got an email saying my results were ready. I logged in expecting to see percentages and a map. Instead, there was a red banner across the top that said, "Please call us immediately regarding your results." My stomach dropped. I called the number, and a woman with a shaky voice told me my DNA had been flagged in a criminal database. My biological father was convicted of murdering 11 women in the 1990s. He was currently on death row. They called him the West Side Strangler. I sat on my kitchen floor for an hour just staring at the wall. The DNA company explained they were legally required to notify law enforcement when there was a match to a criminal case. Within 2 hours, a detective called asking if I'd be willing to answer questions. Then a reporter called. Then another. By the next morning, my face was all over the news. "Daughter of West Side Strangler discovered through DNA test" was the headline on every website. Journalists camped outside my apartment building. My phone rang constantly with numbers I didn't recognize. My boss called me that afternoon. "I'm so sorry, but several clients have expressed concerns. We think it's best if you take a leave of absence until this blows over." My fiancé's parents showed up at our apartment that night. His mom was crying. "We love you, but you have to understand this changes things," she said to him, not to me. "What if it's genetic? What if your children—" She couldn't even finish the sentence. Strangers found my social media accounts and sent me messages. A few people even told me I had murder in my blood, that I was evil by nature, that I should never be allowed to have kids. True crime podcasters did entire episodes analyzing my face and comparing it to my father's mugshot. Someone started a conspiracy theory that I'd been secretly visiting him in prison and helping him. My friends stopped responding to my texts. My fiancé started acting weird around me. One night he was watching me cook dinner and asked, "Do you ever think about hurting people?" I dropped the knife I was holding. "What? No! I've never even met this man." 3 weeks later, he told me he couldn't marry me. He moved out the next day. I lost my job officially a week after that. Then I got a letter from the state prison. My biological father wanted to meet me before his execution. I threw the letter away immediately and tried to pretend it didn't exist. Then I got a Facebook message from a woman I didn't know. "I'm your birth mother. Please, I need to talk to you. It's urgent." We agreed to meet at a coffee shop on the edge of town where no one would recognize me. She was waiting at a back table looking terrified. Her hands were shaking when she reached out to touch mine. "I was 17 when I got pregnant," she said quietly. "He was my boyfriend. I had no idea what he was doing. When the police arrested him, I was 5 months along. I gave you up for adoption because I thought if no one ever knew who your father was, you'd be safe. You'd have a normal life." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry the DNA test ruined that. I wanted to be angry at her, but I just felt empty. His execution is scheduled for 6 months from now," she continued. "The media coverage is going to get so much worse. They're going to follow you everywhere. Show your face constantly. Dig into every part of your life." I already knew that. I was living it. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice even more. "But there's something else you need to know. Something the police never made public." She pulled an old photograph from her purse and slid it across the table. It showed 4 men standing together outside a bar. My father was on the left. "He didn't work alone," she whispered. "He had accomplices. 3 of them. The police only ever caught him. The others were never identified." I stared at the photo. The other 3 men's faces were blurry but visible. "Why are you telling me this?" She looked around the coffee shop like she was afraid someone was listening. "Because your face has been all over the news for 2 weeks. Everyone knows who you are now. Everyone knows you're his daughter." She didn't have to finish the sentence. I understood. The 3 men in this photo were still out there somewhere. And now they knew exactly who I was. They were coming to kill me. I drove home from the coffee shop with the photo in my purse and my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Every car behind me felt like a threat. Every person on the sidewalk could be one of the 3 men. Back in my apartment, I locked the door and pulled all the curtains closed. The afternoon light barely made it through the fabric. I sat on my couch and spread the photo on the coffee table in front of me. 4 men standing outside a bar in the 1990s. My father on the left with his arm around another guy's shoulders. The other 2 standing close together on the right. Their faces were blurry, but you could see basic features. Hair color, build, approximate age. Any one of them could have seen my face on the news. Any one of them knew I existed now. Any one of them might be planning how to kill me right now to protect their secret. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. The neighbor's door closing. Footsteps on the stairs. A car alarm going off in the parking lot. I kept thinking about what my birth mother said. They knew who I was. They knew where to find me. I couldn't just sit here waiting to become a victim like the 11 women my father killed. Around 3 a.m., I realized I had to do something. Hiding wasn't going to keep me safe. These men had stayed hidden for 25 years. They were smart. They were careful. If they wanted me dead, they'd find a way unless I found them first. The next morning, I made coffee and opened my laptop. I started searching everything I could find about the West Side Strangler case online. Most articles focused on my father alone. They called him a lone predator, a monster who acted alone, but I wasn't looking for information about him. I was looking for any mention of other people, associates, friends, anyone police questioned during the investigation. The first dozen articles gave me nothing useful, just details about the murders and the trial and his life before the arrest. Then I found a forum where true crime fans discussed old cases. Someone had posted a question about whether my father really worked alone. Another person replied that early news coverage mentioned police interviewed several people in his social circle, but nobody was ever charged. I spent 2 hours going through newspaper archives from the 1990s. The library database had digital copies of old papers. Most of the coverage focused on the victims and the investigation. But buried in one article from 1996, I found a paragraph that mentioned police interviewed multiple people who knew the suspect. None were charged. Their names were kept out of the coverage to protect the investigation. The article said police were confident they had the right man and he acted alone. But my birth mother's photo proved that was wrong. Those 3 other men existed. They just never got caught. I called my birth mother around noon. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. I asked her everything she could remember about the men in the photo. She was quiet for a long time. Then she started talking. They all hung out at a bar called Murphy's on the west side. It closed down maybe 15 years ago. They worked together at a warehouse near the industrial district. She thought it was a shipping company, but she couldn't remember the name. She only met them a few times when she was dating my father. They made her uncomfortable. The way they looked at her. The way they talked about women. She stopped going to Murphy's with my father after a few months. He said she was being too sensitive. That they were just joking around. She told me she wished she'd trusted her instincts and left him right then. Maybe if she had, some of those women would still be alive. I spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about whether to go to the police. Part of me wanted to hide. Going to the police meant more exposure. More questions. More reporters. But these men were dangerous. If I kept this photo to myself and they killed me, nobody would know they existed. The photo would disappear with me. By evening, I made my decision. Law enforcement needed to know about the accomplices even if it meant putting myself at more risk. At least then someone else would be looking for them. I wouldn't be fighting this alone. The next morning, I put on sunglasses and a baseball cap. I pulled my hair back in a ponytail and wore a plain black jacket. Anything to avoid being recognized. The police station was downtown in an old brick building. I parked 2 blocks away and walked with my head down. Inside, the officer at the front desk looked at me strangely when I approached. I kept the sunglasses on and told him I needed to talk to someone about the West Side Strangler case. He picked up his phone and made a call. 5 minutes later, a woman in a gray suit came down the hallway. She introduced herself as Eleanor Harrington from the cold case unit. She took me upstairs to a small office with a desk and 2 chairs. I pulled out the photo and slid it across the desk. Eleanor picked it up and studied it with intense focus. She asked where I got it. I explained about my birth mother and the coffee shop meeting. Eleanor looked at the photo for a long time without saying anything. Then she told me this was the first concrete evidence anyone had ever presented suggesting my father had accomplices. She said she'd worked cold cases for 8 years and always wondered if the West Side Strangler investigation missed something. The murders stopped so suddenly after his arrest. No similar crimes in the area since then. That suggested either he really did work alone, or his partners were smart enough to stop. She wanted to reopen certain parts of the investigation based on this photo. Eleanor asked if I was willing to work with her unofficially. She explained I wasn't a suspect, but I was potentially a victim. The department would want to keep this quiet. No media, no public announcements. If the accomplices knew we were looking for them, they might run or destroy evidence or come after me more aggressively. She said she needed my help because I had access to my birth mother and information the police didn't have. She also said she understood if I wanted to walk away. This wasn't my fight. I didn't owe anyone anything. But if I helped, we might actually find these men before they found me. I agreed to help her. For the first time since the DNA results destroyed my life, I felt something other than fear and shame. I felt like I had a purpose. Like I was doing something instead of just hiding and waiting for my life to get worse. Eleanor shook my hand and told me to be careful. She gave me her cell phone number and told me to call immediately if anything seemed wrong. If I saw anyone following me. If I got strange messages. Anything at all. She said we were going to find these men together. I left the police station feeling like maybe I wasn't completely alone anymore. Eleanor called me the next morning and asked if I could meet her at a coffee shop downtown. She said she wanted me to meet someone who could help with the investigation. I showed up wearing the same sunglasses and baseball cap I'd worn to the police station. Eleanor was already there, sitting at a corner table with another woman who looked a lot like her. They had the same dark hair and sharp eyes. Eleanor introduced her as Victoria, her younger sister. Victoria worked as a private investigator and had access to databases and software that the police couldn't officially use. She shook my hand and told me she'd already looked at the photograph. She said facial recognition technology had gotten really good in the past few years, and she thought she could identify at least 1 or 2 of the men if we enhanced the image quality. We spent an hour at that coffee shop while Victoria explained how she could search old employment records, driver's license photos, and social media accounts from the 1990s that might have been archived. She said the hardest part would be getting clear enough images from the blurry photo to run through her software. Eleanor told me Victoria had helped solve 3 cold cases in the past 2 years by finding information the police couldn't access through normal channels. I felt a small spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe we could actually find these men. 2 days later, I was walking back to my apartment to grab some clothes. I'd been staying at Eleanor's place because I was too scared to sleep in my own bed. The sun was setting and the street was mostly empty. That's when I noticed the car. A dark blue sedan parked half a block down from my building. I'd seen the same car in that exact spot yesterday morning when I left. My heart started beating faster. I walked past my apartment building without slowing down. The car's engine wasn't running, but I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out their face through the tinted windows. I kept walking until I reached a busy coffee shop 3 blocks away. My hands were shaking when I pulled out my phone and called Eleanor. I described the car and told her the license plate number I'd managed to memorize as I walked past. She told me to stay exactly where I was and keep myself surrounded by people. She said she'd send patrol cars to check out the vehicle. I sat in that coffee shop for over an hour drinking tea I didn't want and watching the door. Every time someone walked in, I jumped. Eleanor called back and her voice sounded serious. She said the license plate came back to a rental car company. Someone was definitely following me and they were smart enough not to use their own vehicle. She told me the patrol cars had checked the area, but the sedan was gone by the time they arrived. Whoever was watching me knew to leave before the police showed up. I felt sick to my stomach. These men knew where I lived. They knew my routine. They'd been watching me and I hadn't even noticed until today. Eleanor told me to come back to her place immediately and not to go anywhere alone. When I got there, Victoria was already waiting. She said I needed to disappear for a while. She suggested I move to a motel outside the city where nobody would recognize me. Somewhere I could pay cash and wouldn't need to show ID or use credit cards that could be traced. I packed a bag with just the basics. Some clothes, my laptop, the photograph, and my phone charger. Victoria called an Uber for me instead of letting me use my own car in case someone had put a tracker on it. She gave me the address of a cheap motel near the highway about 30 miles away. The driver dropped me off at a place called the Crossroads Inn. It had peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. I paid cash for a week and the clerk didn't ask any questions. The room smelled like old cigarettes and the carpet had stains I didn't want to think about. But it had a lock on the door and nobody knew I was there. That's all that mattered. I set up my laptop on the small desk and called Victoria. She'd already started working on enhancing the photograph. She walked me through how to upload it to a secure server so she could work on it with better software. We spent the next several hours on video calls while she adjusted the contrast and sharpness. Slowly, the faces in the photo became clearer. We could see more details in their features, the shapes of their noses and jaws. Victoria pulled up employment records from the warehouse where my father had worked in the 1990s. She'd gotten them through a contact who worked in county records. The files showed my father worked with 12 other men during the time period when the murders happened. We started comparing their old driver's license photos to the faces in the photograph. It was slow work. Some of the men had moved away or died. Others looked so different after 25 years that it was hard to tell if they matched. Victoria cross-referenced each name with current addresses and criminal records. Most of them came back clean. 3 days went by like this. I barely left the motel room except to get food from the gas station next door. I kept the curtains closed and jumped every time I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Victoria and I worked for hours each day, going through records and comparing faces. Then on the 3rd day, she called me with news. She'd found a match. One of the men in the photograph was named Gregory Wilkinson. He still lived in the area under his real name. He ran a construction business and had a website with his photo on it. Victoria sent me the link and I stared at the screen. The man looking back at me was in his 50s with gray hair and smile lines around his eyes. He looked like someone's dad, like a normal person. But when I compared his current photo to the enhanced image from the 1990s, there was no doubt. Same nose, same jaw, same eyes. This was one of the men who'd helped my father kill 11 women. Eleanor ran a background check on him that afternoon. She called me with the results and her voice sounded frustrated. Gregory Wilkinson had no criminal record, not even a parking ticket in the past 10 years. He was married, had an adult son, owned his home, paid his taxes on time. On paper, he looked like a model citizen. He'd been hiding in plain sight for 25 years, building a normal life while my father sat on death row. I pulled up Gregory's construction company website again and looked at his photo. He was standing in front of a house his company had built, wearing a hard hat and giving a thumbs up to the camera. The caption said, "Gregory Wilkinson, owner and founder, building dreams since 1998. I felt like I was going to throw up. This man had helped strangle women and dump their bodies, and now he was building houses and smiling for website photos. He had a wife who probably loved him, a son who probably looked up to him, customers who trusted him to work on their homes. Nobody knew what he really was. Nobody except me and Eleanor and Victoria. And now we had to figure out how to prove it. Eleanor closed her laptop and looked at me with serious eyes. She told me not to go near Gregory under any circumstances. If he figured out we had identified him, he might run or destroy evidence or come straight after me. I nodded, but my hands were shaking. The idea that this man was just living his normal life while knowing what he'd done made me feel sick. Eleanor said she needed to build a case carefully and slowly. Physical evidence from 25 years ago would be hard to find, but she had connections who could help. She left around 8 that night and I locked the door behind her. I checked the lock 3 times before I could walk away from it. That night I lay in the motel bed staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about Gregory's wife and son. They had no idea they were living with someone who helped strangle women and dump their bodies. They probably thought he was a good husband and father. They probably loved him. It was exactly like my situation, except reversed. My adoptive parents had no idea they were raising the daughter of a serial killer. They'd given me a normal childhood and never suspected the truth. Now Gregory's family was living the same lie I had lived my whole life. I wondered if his wife would leave him when she found out. I wondered if his son would look at him the same way my ex-fiancé had looked at me, like I was something dangerous and wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, Victoria called to tell me she was still working on identifying the other 2 men from the photo. The image quality made everything harder. Some of the warehouse employees from that time period had died. Others had moved away and she couldn't track them down. She said it might take weeks to identify everyone. I told her to keep trying. 2 days later, Eleanor showed up at the motel with coffee and bagels. She sat on the edge of the bed and told me the police were quietly investigating Gregory's background. They were looking for any physical evidence that might still exist from the crimes in the 90s. Old storage units, property records, financial transactions from that time period. But after 25 years, most of that stuff was gone or destroyed. Eleanor said they were also checking if Gregory had kept any souvenirs from the murders. Some killers did that. The thought made me want to throw up. I asked Eleanor about protective custody. Maybe the police could put me somewhere safe until they arrested Gregory and whoever else was involved. She shook her head and explained that I wasn't technically a witness to any crime. I was just a potential target. The department couldn't provide official protection based on a decades-old photograph and my birth mother's claims. There wasn't enough concrete evidence yet to justify using resources that way. I felt panic rising in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. Eleanor promised she was doing everything she could. A week went by like that. I stayed in the motel room most of the time. I only left to get food from the gas station next door, or to walk around the parking lot when I felt too trapped inside. My money was running low. The motel cost $40 a night and I was buying all my meals from convenience stores. I couldn't access my old apartment safely because reporters still showed up there sometimes. I couldn't get a job because my face still appeared in true crime social media posts. People recognized me and some of them weren't friendly about it. I checked my bank account one morning and saw I had less than $300 left. That would last maybe another week if I was careful. Then what? I sat on the bed feeling helpless and scared. My phone rang and I saw it was my birth mother. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She asked how I was doing and I told her the truth. I was broke and hiding and terrified. She offered to send me money right away. At first I felt angry. This was all her fault for telling me about the accomplices in the first place. If she'd just kept her mouth shut, I could have gone on not knowing. But then I realized she was trying to help the only way she could. She'd given me information that might save my life, even though it put me in danger. I told her I would take the money and she said she'd wire it that afternoon. Before we hung up, she said something that made me freeze. She admitted she'd suspected my father had help even back when the murders were happening. She'd been too scared to tell the police because she thought they would accuse her of being involved. She was 17 and pregnant and terrified. By the time she was older and braver, she'd convinced herself it was too late to matter. The cases were closed. My father was on death row. What good would it do to bring up old suspicions? I felt like she'd punched me in the stomach. She'd known for almost 30 years that there were other killers out there. She'd kept quiet while those men built normal lives and families. She'd let them get away with murder because she was scared. I told her I had to go and ended the call. I sat there feeling betrayed and angry and confused all at once. She'd been 17. She'd been alone and pregnant with a serial killer's baby. What was she supposed to do? But still, 30 years. She could have said something at any point in 30 years. Eleanor called me that afternoon and her voice sounded tense. She told me someone had accessed the police database records about my father's case 2 days ago. The credentials used didn't match any current investigation. Someone inside the system was looking into this and they shouldn't have been. Either it was a dirty cop or someone had stolen login information. Either way, it meant the accomplices knew the police were investigating. They knew we were getting close to identifying them. Eleanor said I needed to be extra careful now. She was going to have patrol cars drive by the motel a few times each night. I thanked her and hung up. Then I went to the window and looked out at the parking lot. Any one of those cars could belong to someone watching me. Any person walking by could be coming to finish what my father had started. Victoria called the next morning while I was eating gas station donuts on the bed. She said she'd been digging into Gregory's background all night and found something important. His construction company had contracts with the city for the past 15 years. He'd worked on the police station renovation in 2015 and the courthouse expansion in 2018. She explained that someone with those kinds of connections could easily know people inside the system. Maybe a corrupt cop or a city employee who owed him favors. That's probably how someone accessed the database to look up my father's case files. I felt sick thinking about how deep this went. These weren't just random criminals hiding from their past. They'd spent 25 years building real lives with jobs and families and connections that protected them. Gregory had a whole business and contracts and probably knew half the people in local government. The third guy was probably just as established with his own network of people who could help him stay hidden. They'd had decades to create safety nets while I had nothing. No job, no friends, no money, just a motel room and 2 people trying to help me stay alive. Eleanor called an hour later and told me they were bringing Gregory in for questioning the next day. She wanted me to stay at the motel and not contact anyone until after the interview happened. She said it was important that Gregory didn't know I was involved in identifying him. If he thought I was working with police, he might panic and do something stupid. Or he might come after me directly before they could build a case against him. I promised to stay hidden and keep my phone on in case she needed to reach me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Gregory sitting in some interrogation room denying everything while I hid in a cheap motel. I watched TV with the sound low and checked my phone every few minutes. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something at the door. The doorknob rattled like someone was trying to turn it. My whole body went cold. I grabbed my phone and ran into the bathroom, locking that door too. My hands shook so bad I could barely dial Eleanor's number. She answered on the second ring, and I whispered that someone was trying to get into my room. She told me to stay quiet and stay in the bathroom. She was sending patrol cars right away. I sat on the bathroom floor with my back against the tub and listened. The rattling stopped, but I heard footsteps outside moving along the walkway. Then nothing. I stayed there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 8 or 9 minutes. Then I heard sirens and saw red and blue lights flashing through the small bathroom window. I waited until I heard Eleanor's voice calling my name before I came out. She was standing in my room with 2 uniformed cops. They'd checked the whole area, but whoever tried to break in was gone. Eleanor crouched down and looked at the lock on my door. She showed me the scratches around the keyhole where someone had tried to pick it. This wasn't some random person. This was someone who knew which room I was in and came prepared with tools. Eleanor said we needed to move me right away to a different motel across town. I threw my stuff in my bag while the cops waited outside. Eleanor drove me herself instead of letting me take an Uber. On the way, she admitted the situation was worse than she'd thought at first. The accomplices weren't just hiding anymore. They were actively hunting me. They were willing to take risks and come after me even though they knew police were investigating. That meant they saw me as a bigger threat to their freedom than the police were. We pulled into a different motel parking lot on the other side of the city. This one looked even cheaper than the last place. Eleanor paid for 3 nights in cash and walked me to the room. She told me to keep the door locked and call her immediately if anything felt wrong. After she left, I pushed the dresser in front of the door and sat on the bed feeling scared and exhausted. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to my phone ringing. It was Victoria calling to tell me she'd identified the second accomplice from the photograph. His name was Bronwyn Reyes, but then she said he died in a car accident back in 2003. That meant only 2 accomplices were still alive and threatening me. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. If anything, it made things worse. Gregory and the third unidentified man probably knew each other well after 25 years. They'd had all that time to plan for the possibility of getting caught. They'd probably talked about what they'd do if someone ever connected them to the murders. And now that someone was me. The next morning, Eleanor called and told me to meet her at the police station. She wanted me there for Gregory's interview. I could watch through the one-way glass while she questioned him. I got there early, and a uniformed cop led me to a small dark room with a window looking into the interrogation room. Gregory was already sitting at the metal table with a man in a suit next to him. His lawyer, probably. Eleanor came in and sat across from them. She started asking Gregory about his relationship with my father back in the 90s. Gregory said they worked together at the warehouse but weren't really friends. Just co-workers who sometimes grabbed drinks after shifts. Eleanor showed him the photograph and asked him to explain it. Gregory barely looked at it before saying he didn't remember when it was taken, or who else was in the picture. His voice stayed calm, but I could see his hands clenched together on the table. His jaw was tight. He was lying, and his body knew it even if his words didn't show it. Eleanor asked more questions about where he was on specific dates when women disappeared. Gregory's lawyer interrupted and said his client didn't have to answer questions about events from almost 30 years ago without proper notice. The lawyer stood up and said they were done talking. Eleanor tried to ask one more question, but the lawyer put his hand on Gregory's shoulder and guided him toward the door. Right before they left, Gregory stopped and looked directly at the one-way glass. He couldn't see me, but somehow I knew he was looking right at where I stood. His eyes were cold and empty. My heart started racing, and I stepped back from the window even though I knew he couldn't actually see through it. He smiled just a little bit before his lawyer pulled him out of the room. I felt pure terror run through my whole body because in that moment I understood something. Gregory knew I was watching. He knew I was the reason police had brought him in, and he was telling me without words that this wasn't over. I left the police station feeling sick to my stomach and called Eleanor from my car to ask what we should do next. She told me to meet her at Victoria's office in an hour because they needed to talk to me about something important. When I got there that evening, both sisters were waiting with serious expressions on their faces. Eleanor told me that Gregory's son Raymond had been asking questions around town about me over the past few days. He saw all the news coverage weeks ago when my face was everywhere, and now he was confused about why police brought his father in for questioning about the West Side Strangler case. Raymond apparently told a friend he didn't understand what his dad had to do with any of it, and that friend mentioned it to someone who knew Victoria. Victoria leaned forward and said we needed to approach Raymond very carefully, because he might not know anything about his father's past. If we could convince him to help us, he might be able to provide information, or even evidence from inside the house that we couldn't get any other way. She explained that Raymond might have access to old documents, photos, or could watch Gregory's current activities without raising suspicion. I felt my stomach twist at the idea of dragging Gregory's son into this mess. I told them I knew exactly what it felt like to discover your parent was connected to horrible crimes, and I didn't want to put someone else through that kind of pain. Eleanor looked at me and said Raymond might already be in danger if Gregory suspected his son was asking too many questions or getting suspicious. She pointed out that Gregory just got released after police questioning, and he would be watching everyone around him closely now, including his own family. If Raymond kept digging on his own without knowing how dangerous his father really was, something bad could happen to him. Victoria said she could make contact with Raymond through a business person they both knew, someone who could arrange a meeting at a place where no one would recognize us. I thought about it for a long time before finally agreeing to attend the meeting because Raymond deserved to hear the truth from someone who understood what he was facing. We couldn't just leave him stumbling around in the dark asking questions that might get him hurt. 2 days later, Victoria called to say she'd set up the meeting for the next afternoon at a diner about 40 minutes outside town. I drove there feeling nervous about what I was going to say to this man whose whole life was about to change. Raymond was already sitting in a back booth when we arrived, looking confused and a little bit angry, like he thought this might be some kind of trap. He was probably in his late 20s with the same build as Gregory but a kinder face. Victoria made quick introductions, and then I pulled out the old photograph and slid it across the table toward him. I explained who I was and pointed to the man on the left side of the photo, telling Raymond that was my biological father, the West Side Strangler. Then I pointed to the second man in the picture and told him that was his father, Gregory, and that my birth mother said these men worked together to murder 11 women back in the 1990s. Raymond's face went completely white, and he pushed the photo back toward me like it was something poisonous. He said there was no way his father could be involved in anything like that. His dad ran a construction business and coached Little League Baseball when Raymond was a kid. I understood the denial because I'd felt the exact same thing when I first learned about my own father. I told Raymond about getting the DNA test results for my birthday, and how my whole life fell apart within 24 hours. I explained that I lost my job and my fiancé and all my friends because people thought I had murder in my blood just from being related to a killer. I said I knew how scary it was to think that your parent could be capable of terrible things, but his father's past actions didn't define who Raymond was as a person. Raymond sat there quietly for a minute looking down at his hands, and then he admitted his father had been acting really strange since my face started appearing in the news coverage. Gregory had been working late almost every night, making phone calls in his car instead of inside the house, and asking Raymond weird questions about police procedures. Raymond said he'd thought about becoming a cop right after college, so he knew some stuff about how investigations worked. And apparently Gregory wanted to know specific details about how long police could hold someone without charges and what kind of evidence they needed for an arrest. Eleanor asked Raymond if he would be willing to help us by paying attention to his father's activities and reporting anything suspicious. Raymond looked torn between wanting to protect his family and needing to know the truth about what his father might have done. He said he couldn't believe his dad would hurt anyone, but he also couldn't explain why Gregory was acting so paranoid and secretive lately. Eleanor told him we weren't asking him to spy on his father or put himself in danger, just to keep his eyes open and let us know if anything seemed off. Raymond sat there struggling with the decision for what felt like forever, and I could see him trying to balance loyalty to his father against the possibility that Gregory had helped murder 11 women decades ago. Finally, he said he would help us, but only if we promised to keep his mother out of this as much as possible. He explained that his mom had a serious heart condition, and the stress of learning the truth about Gregory could literally kill her. We all agreed that we would protect Raymond's mother and only involve her if there was absolutely no other choice. Raymond gave Victoria his phone number and said he would pay closer attention to what his father was doing, but he still didn't want to believe Gregory was actually guilty of anything. Over the next week, Raymond called Victoria almost every day with updates about his father's behavior. Gregory was meeting with someone Raymond didn't recognize, always at different locations around the city like they were trying not to be seen together. On the 5th day, Raymond managed to photograph the man from a distance using his phone while pretending to be looking at something else. He sent the photo to Victoria immediately, and she started running it through facial recognition software and comparing it to old records from the warehouse where my father used to work. I waited at Victoria's office while she worked on identifying the mystery man, feeling like we were finally making real progress toward figuring out who all 3 accomplices were. Victoria kept pulling up different databases and old employment records, cross-referencing everything with the time period when the murders happened. After about 3 hours of searching, she finally found a match that made her stop and stare at her computer screen. She turned the monitor toward me and Eleanor so we could see what she'd discovered about the man Gregory had been meeting with in secret. The screen showed a driver's license photo from 15 years ago, and Victoria pointed at the name, Sterling Reyes. She pulled up another record showing his date of birth, and I did the math in my head. He was only 16 when my father got arrested for the murders. Victoria opened another file showing Sterling's connection to Bronwyn Reyes, the accomplice who died in 2003. Brothers. Eleanor leaned closer to the screen and asked Victoria to pull up everything she could find on Sterling's activities over the past 25 years. Victoria's fingers moved across the keyboard, opening database after database. Sterling had no criminal record. He worked as an accountant. He owned a house in a quiet neighborhood. But Victoria found something else buried in old property records. Sterling had co-signed the lease on a storage unit with his brother Bronwyn back in 1998, just months before my father's arrest. The unit was still active under Sterling's name. Eleanor grabbed her phone and started making calls to get a warrant for that storage unit. I sat there staring at Sterling's photo on the screen. He looked so normal, just a regular guy with a regular job. But he'd spent decades protecting the men who helped my father kill 11 women. Victoria found more connections. Sterling had made regular visits to Gregory over the years, always meeting in different places like they were trying to stay under the radar. She pulled up old phone records showing calls between Sterling and Gregory going back years. These men had been coordinating their cover-up for my entire life. Eleanor finished her call and told us the warrant would take a few hours. She wanted to keep eyes on Sterling's house in the meantime to make sure he didn't run. Victoria kept digging through records while we waited. She found bank statements showing Sterling had helped Gregory with those suspicious cash deposits after the murders. The conspiracy went deeper than just 3 men in a photo. It was families protecting each other, covering up evidence, making sure the truth stayed buried. My phone rang and Raymond's name appeared on the screen. I answered and heard panic in his voice. His father found the photos Raymond had been taking of Gregory's meetings. Gregory saw them on Raymond's phone and lost it completely. Raymond was scared. He said Gregory grabbed him and started yelling about betrayal and family loyalty. His mother was crying in the background. Raymond said his father was throwing things in bags and talking about leaving town. Eleanor heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. She got on her radio and sent patrol cars to the Wilkinson house immediately. She told Raymond to get himself and his mother out of the house if he could do it safely. Raymond said he would try. Eleanor kept the radio connection open while we waited for updates from the patrol cars. It took them 8 minutes to reach the Wilkinson house. The officers radioed back describing what they found. Gregory was in the driveway loading suitcases into his car. Lavinia was standing in the doorway crying and asking Gregory what was happening. Raymond was trying to calm his mother down while staying away from his father. The officers approached Gregory and asked him to stop what he was doing. Gregory tried to get in his car anyway. The officers had to physically prevent him from leaving. Eleanor told them to bring Gregory in for questioning based on the new evidence Victoria had found. Victoria pulled up the financial records on her screen and sent them to Eleanor's phone. Old bank statements showing large cash deposits around the times of several murders. Combined with the photograph, Raymond's testimony about recent threats, and Gregory's attempt to flee, it was enough to arrest him. The officers put Gregory in handcuffs while Lavinia collapsed on the front steps. Raymond called me back 20 minutes later. His voice was shaking. He said his mother was in shock and couldn't stop crying. The officers were still at the house taking Gregory away. Raymond didn't know what to tell his mother about why this was happening. I didn't have good answers for him. Eleanor focused on Sterling now that Gregory was in custody. She put out alerts to watch for Sterling's car and his known locations. If Sterling heard about Gregory's arrest, he would run. Victoria tracked Sterling's cell phone location using methods she said were better if Eleanor didn't know the details about. The phone was moving. Sterling was already on the road heading toward the state border. Eleanor made more calls, this time to state police at the border checkpoints. She gave them Sterling's description, his license plate number, and instructions to stop him. We waited in Victoria's office for 3 hours. Eleanor paced back and forth. Victoria kept tracking Sterling's phone as it moved closer to the border. I sat there feeling like everything was happening too fast. 2 days ago, we were just identifying people in an old photo. Now one accomplice was in custody and the other was running. Sterling's phone stopped moving at the border checkpoint. Eleanor's radio crackled with an update. State police had stopped Sterling's car. They were searching it. Eleanor told them what to look for. 5 minutes later, the radio crackled again. Officers found a gun in Sterling's glove box. They found something else too. A folder full of surveillance photos. Photos of me, walking to Victoria's office, sitting in my motel room window, getting into Eleanor's car. Sterling had been tracking me for weeks. He knew where I was going and who I was meeting with. He'd been planning something. Eleanor told the officers to arrest Sterling immediately. She listed off charges related to the gun and the stalking evidence. Sterling was in custody within minutes. Eleanor turned to me and said both remaining accomplices were now locked up. The immediate physical threat was over. I didn't have to hide in cheap motels anymore. I didn't have to look over my shoulder every time I walked outside. The men who wanted to kill me were behind bars. I felt something release in my chest, but I was too exhausted to figure out what emotion it was. The media picked up the story fast. By the next morning, news websites were running headlines about the West Side Stranglers' accomplices finally being arrested after 25 years. But this time the coverage was different. The reporters focused on the investigation and the police work. They talked about Eleanor and the cold case unit. They mentioned DNA evidence and financial records. My name appeared in some articles, but Eleanor had managed to keep most of my involvement confidential. The stories said an anonymous tip led to the breakthrough. No photos of me, no interviews with people analyzing my face, just facts about the arrests and the evidence against Gregory and Sterling. I read through article after article from my motel room, and for the first time since the DNA test results came back, the media wasn't making me the story. 2 days after the arrests, Eleanor called to tell me Raymond wanted to meet at her office. I drove there feeling nervous about seeing him again after everything that happened with his father. Raymond was waiting in the conference room looking tired and older than the last time we talked. He stood up when I walked in and started apologizing immediately for what his father did, for not seeing the signs earlier, for putting me in danger by taking those photos. I stopped him and told him he had nothing to apologize for, because none of this was his fault or his responsibility. He asked how I managed to deal with finding out about my own father, and I wrote down the name and number of the therapist who helped me process everything in those first awful weeks. Raymond took the paper and folded it carefully, then thanked me and left, looking like he was carrying a weight he'd never be able to put down completely. The next morning, news broke that Lavinia filed for divorce from Gregory. Her lawyer released a statement saying she had absolutely no knowledge of her husband's criminal past and was cooperating fully with investigators. I read the statement on my phone while eating breakfast at a diner and felt genuine sympathy for her. She was another woman whose life got destroyed by choices these men made decades ago. Another person who built a life with someone without knowing who they really were. My birth mother called that afternoon crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She kept saying thank you over and over, relieved that the men who threatened me were finally locked up and couldn't hurt either of us anymore. Then she apologized again for not going to police 25 years ago, when she first suspected my father had help. I told her I understood she was just 17 and scared, that she was protecting herself and protecting me the only way she knew how back then. We talked for almost an hour, the longest conversation we'd ever had, and for the first time it felt like talking to family, instead of talking to a stranger who happened to give birth to me. Eleanor helped me apply for victim compensation funds the following week. We sat in her office filling out forms that documented my lost income, the cost of hiding in motels for weeks, the therapy bills that were piling up. The process was slow and bureaucratic, with no guarantee I'd actually receive anything, but it felt good to do something concrete toward rebuilding instead of just surviving day to day. Eleanor explained the state had programs for crime victims, even when the crimes happened decades ago, and my situation qualified because the accomplices actively threatened me this year. I started looking for a new apartment in a different part of the city where fewer people would recognize my face from the news coverage. I spent days driving around neighborhoods I'd never visited before, looking at rental listings and trying to imagine starting over somewhere completely new. I wasn't ready to return to my old neighborhood or my old apartment building where journalists had camped outside for weeks. I needed a place where I could walk to the store without wondering if someone would recognize me and start asking questions or taking photos. Victoria called me one evening while I was looking at apartment listings online. She asked if I'd be interested in working as a research assistant at her private investigation firm. She said my attention to detail and my personal understanding of complex cases would make me valuable to her business, that she'd seen how thorough I was during our investigation of the accomplices. I asked if she was just offering out of pity, and she laughed and said she didn't do pity hires because her business reputation mattered too much. I accepted the job offer 2 days later after thinking it through carefully. The work would be completely different from my old job, focusing on helping other people find answers instead of the marketing work I used to do. Victoria started me on cases that had nothing to do with my father or his accomplices, which felt important. I researched insurance fraud for one client and tracked down a missing person for another. It felt good to use the investigative skills I developed out of necessity over the past months to actually help people instead of just trying to survive. 3 months after the accomplices' arrests, I was settling into my new apartment in a quiet neighborhood across town. The media attention had finally faded to almost nothing, with only occasional mentions when Gregory and Sterling's court dates approached. I was building a life defined by my own choices rather than my father's crimes, working at Victoria's firm during the day, and slowly furnishing my apartment on weekends. I still had hard days when someone would recognize me, or when I'd see a true crime podcast episode about the case pop up in my feed. But I was no longer just surviving and hiding and waiting for the next bad thing to happen. I was actually living again, making my own decisions, building something new that belonged only to me.